Hey listeners, we're so glad you're a part of the listening family. Or if you're watching, we're so glad that you're watching the Missions Podcast in video form too. We're doing a lot of new and exciting things, and we want to hear from you. Now, you guys are always super good about leaving us notes when you're encouraged or when you have a question or even a critique. But what we want to do is ask the hard questions. And so we're offering a survey. The first 10 people that fill it out are going to receive a $10 gift card for Amazon or whatever online retailer, or maybe they just want to give that money back to a ministry of their choice. All of the options are there for you, but either way, we want to make it matter for the first 10 people that fill out our survey. We want to know what resonates best with you. We want to know what we can be doing to improve. We want to make sure that the content that we provide you with week in and week out is what's going to most equip you and encourage you in your ministry, whether you're at home, here in the States, or wherever you are in the world. We want it to be a blessing to you as well. So go to missionspodcast.com/survey in order to participate. That's missionspodcast.com/survey. And remember, the first 10 participants will receive a $10 Amazon gift card or a gift card to the place of their choice. Thank you for participating. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media for ABWE, coming to you from the studio here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, our headquarters here, and joined remotely through the power of the web by Scott Dunford, pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. And Scott, this is our first time back in the saddle after our extensive time in North Carolina at the Radius Conference. At the time of this recording, I'm working through those recordings, those videos. We're getting them scheduled. We're getting them put out. I was reminded of some of the great conversations that we had with Kevin DeYoung, Ian Hamilton. If you haven't had a chance to go back yet in the feed and listen to some of those, if you're watching or listening to this, we'd encourage you to do so. We had some of our favorite interviews. We'd love to hear what your favorite interviews were. Scott, I'd love to hear kind of what your highlights were from that time that we had together.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I think we've talked about it a little bit, but I think especially talking to Ian Hamilton about, what does it mean to pursue Christ in those dry seasons still sticks with me. Actually, I went out and bought all of his books and I've been reading them. So I guess that tells you a little bit about how it's gone.
That's good. Yeah, I'm sure Ian is anxiously watching all of those book sales, knowing him. I'm sure that's his top priority. And if you're not yet a subscriber, go ahead and subscribe so that you have access to the full feed. And while you're there, leave us a positive rating and review in your platform of choice. That really gets this in front of people that can be blessed by it. I got a text message from our friend of the show, Matt Bennett, yesterday saying that I'm really giving into kind of the woke spirit of the age by giving people their choice of which podcast platform that they prefer, that they choose to identify with most based off of their personal preferences. And I felt totally called out for that. So that's just a shout out to Matt. Matt, there you go. That's your freebie against me. And we're going to move on from that. We're going to dive in with our current guest. Scott, can you introduce Joel for us?
It's great to have another pastor from Michigan, Pastor Joel Wayne, joining us from Chapel Point Church there in the Grand Rapids area, Hudsonville. Also, he's going to tell us a little bit about Be the Church and a part of the ministry there that he's developed. And he's also an author. He's written about this topic of leadership. I think it's going to come out under a different title soon, but you can still go out and find a book called Steer, 8 Practices to Drive Leadership. But Joel, it's so great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, your ministry, and I'd love to introduce our listeners to Be the Church.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it so much. Yeah, Chapel Point is the church. I've been here for about 8.5 years. We're in between Grand Rapids and Holland, and I've pastored a little bit of everywhere, Georgia and Kentucky and Connecticut, right outside of New York. And really, when I was called here about 8.5 years ago, I stepped into a church that said, you know what? We're not satisfied with what churches have become and what they are. And I didn't believe it at first. I said no to the opportunity to come here, and they convinced me that they really did want to evaluate, okay, we got to do things differently. We're not okay with the end result. And it's not just about a church, it's about the kingdom of God. And we're not okay with the results of those that we see of disciple making and of church planting and really trying to advance the kingdom. And they convinced me they were serious about it. So I stepped in here, and it's been an amazing ride of watching God just work and move here at Chapel Point. And then a couple of years ago, actually the day after the world shut down, maybe you're familiar with a little thing called COVID, and that whole pandemic. We started something called Be the Church. We're already doing it somewhat, but we stepped in and we're helping through cohorts and conferences and coaching. We've partnered with the State Convention of Michigan, and we help do their church revitalization and leadership development. And we also now do it for the Northeast Regional Direction of Sin Network, which is North American Mission Board, for the 6 New England states, and really helping them and stepping in alongside of them. So it's a lot of fun to jump into cohorts with pastors and really to challenge them and push them. That's kind of what we do.
That's great. And that goes right into our topic today of talking about leadership and developing leadership. So before we even dive into this whole discussion of how do we develop leaders, it's a perennial topic. We've talked about it before on this show. It keeps coming up because it's so crucial. And we also have a deficit of leadership in ministry as well as in our country. So before we dive into like, how do we develop leaders? How do you define leadership? What is leadership as you see it?
Let me nuance it a little bit, if that's okay, and say what's spiritual leadership, because I do believe that the majority of churches are hiring chaplains, not spiritual leaders. And we need churches hiring spiritual leaders, not chaplains. And because the church as a whole is so poor in leadership, what's happened is we're in a dilemma. The church is going, man, is it easier to call leaders to the pastorate, or is it better to call the current pastor to leadership? What's easier to do? And there's a dilemma that we have with it. So, I tell people all the time, I'm not a counselor. I'm more of a coach. I am definitely a spiritual leader of sorts, not the traditional pastor. But I think that's what we need in the church today. I literally wrote down something about the definition of spiritual leadership, and you can find that all over the place. I know that there are different definitions from people like Henry Blackaby and others, but I think it's equipping the believer to achieve God's goal with sustainable excellence. And most of the people in the church today don't know what God's goal really is. They can't define it because churches love to be ambiguous, right?
Of course.
Because that way we don't have to ever lose.
Yeah.
Right? We don't have to ever lose. We always win no matter what, even though we are failing as a whole. And so I go, man, equipping the believer to achieve God's goal with sustainable excellence. So what's your strategy? And that's kind of what we do. We force pastors to go, if you really know the call of God for your church, give me the 3 pieces of strategy to make sure you execute it. And are you willing to measure it so that you're willing to advance the kingdom?
Joel, let me dive in a little bit on that, because there's some things in even what you laid out there very briefly that I'd love to unpack.
Yeah.
Leadership's a buzzword, obviously. It's also somewhat new in our vernacular. You wouldn't find that maybe a few hundred years ago so much as other terms used in its place, right? I was reading through 1 Timothy the other day. You don't read a lot about leadership, and yet leadership is all of what that book is about, but you do read, for instance, about elders who rule well. So there's an idea of rule, of exercising authority, which is something that we're a little bit wary of now, but used to be a lot more understood to be a part of what leadership necessarily involves. And you distinguished between leadership and chaplains, which I'm hearing you say that I'm thinking of just sort of the guy who just loves to kind of be around people and counsel them and encourage them and kind of lead them into God's presence and minister those means of grace to them, but not necessarily exercise authority. Is that sort of the distinction that you're making? Because if so, even though we haven't even transitioned to the topic of missions yet, I can see a ton of overlap with what we would say about missionaries themselves.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it in terms of the delineation between those two different things. And we need chaplains. I always want to make sure I tell people we need chaplains. We need caregivers. We need people who go, I want to help people walk forward. That's called a disciple. If you work at a church, to me, you need to be very aware of what God's called you to in that church, the strategy that you have to execute it that embraces the church's vision as a whole. And then you need to hold yourself accountable to that. And if you're not doing that, I think you're called a lay person. You shouldn't receive a paycheck. And I know people are going to push on that all day long. Doesn't matter to me. I'm not okay with what the capital C church has become in terms of our mission and our calling. And so we have to evaluate I would challenge people. Put a piece of paper there and say, what is the difference between a spiritual leader and then a chaplain? And we do idolize leadership. But the reason we're idolizing leadership today, I believe, is because our society is rudderless. And so anything that can be seen as a rudder can be gravitated toward and held on to, even if it's not of God. We see it constantly. And so we need to make sure that as spiritual leaders, we're providing the appropriate rudder that's pointing toward Christ and toward the Word of God.
So one of the things that you said then too in the introduction, you mentioned that you don't think the church needs more people who are just exclusively chaplains and not also leaders. And so it sounds like you're saying there's some kind of a leadership crisis in the church, or we might even want to take that by extension to say, well, maybe there's a leadership crisis on the mission field. Is that the case as far as you see it, and why?
Listen, I think you got to be very cautious because we're speaking in stereotypical form, right?
Right.
But every
Yes.
stereotype has truth to it. And I know that there are always exceptions to the rule. So you want to be I want to be very cautious in saying that. But yeah, I think we have a crisis. We have more, whether it be on the mission field, whether it be within the church, we have more people in the last 50 years who have claimed to know Christ than ever before in history, with more resources at our disposal. And only 6 to 7% of churches are actually growing at least the pace of the society around them. And yeah, that's a crisis to me, to squander so much. And why is that? And I think there's a lot of reasons for it. You know, I think we struggle to tell the story, and we struggle to do leadership outside of the name of a person rather than in the name of a movement. And that's a hard thing to do. You know, even in my book, we don't ever promote my book anywhere because I think churches are often personality driven, and I get it. God gives apostolic leadership, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But it's a really hard tension to live in, to celebrate the mission of that apostolic leader and not the apostolic leader. And we have to figure out that tension better, I think, within the church. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
What are some of the things you're trying to do to solve that problem? I mean, you've talked about be the church, but I'd love to hear you kind of flesh that out a little bit.
We're all sinners. All right. So we're very clear about that. I think we all make mistakes. We all mess up. And the natural default of a sinner is pride. And so if you don't have a plan to prevent against it, I think you will fall to it. And I think that includes the church. So all my team knows I have a dozen of staff. And if they saw my book if I saw my book sitting around in the gathering area, I would be ticked. And you don't see my name anywhere in this church. You don't see a picture of me anywhere in the church. When I introduce myself, I'm Joel, one of the pastors. And when they introduce themselves, they are Luke, one of the pastors, or Jim or Steve, one of the pastors. It's the same thing. We have different roles, but we have the same value in what that role is in terms of what we're called to. So we're very, very cautious. They never know when I'm preaching. They never know where I'm going to be preaching, anything else. Those are some things that we've put in place.
It sounds like you're part of the same convention I'm a part of as a pastor. I was down in Anaheim, and I went to a 9 Marks event. Mark Dever was speaking, and someone asking a question about the health of mission organizations, and particularly the mission organization, the IMB. But this is applicable to ABWE, any I think mission organization. And they were talking about the health of the organization, and he made a point that I thought it obviously it really stuck with me. And he said I'm paraphrasing here, but we can't, the health of our missionaries on the field are always going to reflect the health of our churches back here in the States. We can't expect to have healthy missions if we don't have healthy churches. And so I think there's a natural connection between leadership and missions, even though we are certainly talking about what's happening in Grand Rapids or what's happening in Fremont, California, or, we're in our own local churches. So the question then is, what can churches like Chapel Point, like Redeemer Church in Fremont, what can we do to develop leadership pipelines within the church that can be then reflected, obviously, on the mission field as we send out missionaries?
So what I can just tell you what we're doing, because man, if I had the answer to that, I'd share it with you and we'd both be like crazy wealthy right now. But
that's the goal.
So what we're trying to do is in the next 3 years, we have an initiative where 500 of our adults go on short-term mission. Now, is that always a catalytic movement for people? It's not, but it is often a catalytic movement for people to take an additional step forward in understanding who God is and how they want to then communicate that to the world, how they want to live in that. And so we want to send 500 adults on short-term missions in the next 3 years. And then we also are looking at giving away, roughly $4 million at the same time toward missions. So one of my jobs in those 3 years, as the lead pastor here and with my roles and responsibilities is to keep the eyes of Chapel Point off of Chapel Point. I firmly believe that. And so I would encourage every pastor or any leader of an organization out there to evaluate how they're trying to keep the eyes of their organization off of their organization, because we're so self-absorbed, whether we want to be or not. I believe that of myself. I believe that of everybody, right? We don't want to be, and we want to stand for Christ, but it's so easy to focus on ourselves. So then how do we take the eyes of our organization off of our organization? And we have come up with ways of how do we best do that. One, we give away our resources in a massive amount, a crazy percentage. One, we're asking our people to go serve other places, partnering with missionaries such as ABWE, right? And we're asking them to go be a part of that. And then we're also developed something called network groups. Instead of just being in a small group, be in a network group. And we're walking people through the themes of the first 12 chapters of John. And we're asking we're starting with 50 adults to lead network groups with non-believers in their communities, wherever they're naturally networking. If we can have 50, we want to start there. We're doing it this fall. If we can have 50 lay people, each with 4 or 5 people in their place of employment or in a school, it can be a bowling league, all speaking about that. That means we have hundreds of people hearing about Christ that didn't. And we, as much as telling those people about Jesus, I think it's preparing the hearts of the leader of that network group for something greater.
So are you seeing within those network groups leaders emerge, or do you identify them and seek to cultivate that? How are you using those network groups to develop leaders for mission? Is that happening? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's just starting to take, and we've mentioned the ideas, and already people have just said, I'm doing it. And so now they're doing it, and I'm not even through the series yet. And what we're finding are people are growing in their courage to speak of Jesus. Right? You know, one of the things we often speak of is what you are silent to, you will end up concurring with. What you remain silent to, you will end up concurring with. And so many leaders today, they're remaining silent to things because they don't have the courage to really speak it. They don't know what the people around them will say. And so it's giving them the courage to speak truth with love, with grace, no matter where they are, what they're doing. And as a result, they're gaining the courage and the confidence to take steps in obedience that they never would have done before. They're asking, is God calling me to ministry? And that gets into other stuff. And while we've started partnerships with universities and even redoing seminary models, we think in the future, because it's not currently working. How do we do this better to give people the resources to step into missions?
I love what you said just there, that those network groups need to be a testing ground to develop courage. Courage is so often the thing that's most lacking in a leadership candidate, because so often our churches, our ministries are these hermetically sealed environments where there's really no risk. There's little risk, and so there's little reward. And so giving people a chance to be bold, to speak out, to exercise that courage, because that's so often what's lacking when their leadership is actually field tested. But to transition to the field, to the issue of the mission field, I'm dealing with 2 situations right now just in our life, in our ministry, where we're seeing people who are sent out onto the field with one understanding, with one relationship with either their sending church or with an agency, with one type of a relationship that existed. And then things changed entirely once they were on the field. And in some of these conversations, you're questioning a person's motives. You're not sure what's going on, what changed, what happened. And that happens so often for people, right? And so how are you making sure that, for instance, with a missionary that you would send, how can we make sure that they're still a part of that leadership pipeline, that even though they've been shot out of the gun, right, that they've left the barrel, that they're still flying in the same trajectory with that pipeline, they're still being developed along those lines, and that it still bears fruit and it's not taking them some other direction?
Yeah, so that's an area we're still trying to learn in. I can simply tell you what we're doing. We have a tiered structure, to how we support missions and missionaries. And if you're a tier 1 missionary or a tier 2 missionary, what that means is you automatically have small groups that come around you who are going to be in continual relationship with you. And that's considered our small groups. One of our 3 components of a small group is biblical direction and accountability. And so they're holding people accountable to what they know that they've been called to. That's one of the ways that we do it, because I can't put everybody on the stage on our scale that we have here. So we have to build those relationships differently. Mature leaders invite accountability. We often say that as well. So knowing that mature leaders invite accountability, it's best done through relationship. So if you're not maintaining a relationship with those individuals, I think it's going to be nearly impossible. If people here don't want to be in deep relationship, we simply don't support them. And everybody's got to find their own place on that. That's where we come. And we define what those relationships look like in terms of how often we will be in front of each other and how often we're going to be even on a Zoom call with one another and holding each other accountable. Part of that then comes to helping people understand the difference between design and desire. Because what I've learned with missionaries, but also pastors, with leaders, the majority of people can tell you what they desire far easier than they can tell you how God has designed them. Right? And so how do we help them in that accountability? And what we have found is that's a rudder. I mentioned that rudder before. That's a rudder to help people. Churches need to do that. Missionaries need to do that. Listen, missionaries are going to reflect a church, but the church reflects the individuals. Right? So the church is a byproduct of who the people are who comprise the church.
Yeah.
If you have a bunch of individuals telling people about Jesus, your church is telling a bunch of people about Jesus, and then your missionaries are doing the same. So we can't stop at just the church, and we have to help people know the difference between design and desire.
So how are you helping, if you're sitting down with, a new pastor on your team or a missionary that's wanting to be sent out, and you're helping them to understand how they're designed, what are some of the things that you do to help them understand? Because I talk to young people all the time. I've got 4 young adults in my home. Clearly, that is something that they're still trying to get down to. And I here I am, almost 46 years old, and I feel like I'm just finally kind of getting an idea of who I am. So how do you help guide people through that process?
Well, one, you look so good for 46 years old.
Thank you. I
just want to throw that out there.
You wouldn't believe it, but I don't even work out. I mean, that's just all natural.
This is why we had to go to video. We just had to let people see Scott and feast their eyes on him.
Yeah. Now he's realizing, that was Scott talking, not Alex. Yeah. No, Alex looks really good for 46. But go ahead. Sorry, Joel.
He does. He looks really good. All of our members, they jump on our website and you get to fill out a spiritual gift assessment. Like, what are your natural inclinations? What are your natural leanings? Most people know what they've been told to do. They've never discovered what to do. It's the same idea of people in the church. They know what they've been told to believe, but they've never discovered the truth for themselves. Right? The hardest people to help are the ones who don't know they're lost. That type of thinking. And so we help people to understand who God is in their life, the giftings that God has given to them. And, when I'm working with pastors, which is what that initial question was, how do we help pastors do that? One, we have to let pastors discover that for themselves. Here are your natural wirings, right? Rarely do the people I work with, and I work with a lot of pastors, does it come up, leadership is the number one thing, right? But yet now their church is expected to lead them to do crazy hard, courageous things in the midst of crisis. And so it doesn't mean they can't be the lead pastor, but it does mean that they need to invite others with those giftings to come alongside of them.
Yeah.
But we don't do it. Why? Pride, insecurity. Pride and insecurity are twin sisters, right? So there's all different components, that we have to factor in. But we help people go through those gift assessments of knowing what their natural wiring is. And then we go, what has God really called you to in terms of even your church? And so we incorporate a lot of the lay leadership of a church with the lead pastor to say, we help them walk a journey of going, what has God really called you to? And then develop out that strategic plan to say, here's 3 things that we will do. And that's going to even let us say no to all these other things. And in doing that, what we see all the time are pastors who their shoulders get lighter because they're not expected to have to do all the budgeting, all the hiring, preach really well, right? Do all the ministry equipping. What we have made the church in America, in the Western environment, I would argue, and my sister-in-law has a PhD in this, teaches at Wake Forest, she'll tell you, the church is the most dysfunctional unit there is organizationally. Because we expected good people to, just 2-3 good people to do everything. And that's not what God has made us as the body of Christ.
Right.
And so as we walk that journey, I know I'm not trying to be ambiguous with it, but we walk that journey of self-exploration of both the person and the church through their leadership. And as that happens through relationship, we see a different vibrancy. And we see churches baptizing for the first time in 3 years, literally as of last week. We see people all of a sudden going, you know what, maybe I'm called to more for the very first time since they've known Christ for 14 years. All of these things start to happen.
Joel, I do have a follow-up question. I do want to transition this to talk more about how this would happen in a cross-cultural space and how it would happen on the mission field. But there's something that you said that's kind of stuck in my craw, and I want to talk about it for just a second. And it's this idea that as you're coming in, as you're talking to pastors, you're finding some aren't identifying as having the strongest the strongest leadership gifts. Okay. The question is, what is the difference, though, between someone who has that leadership calling and perhaps just isn't displaying all of those gifts that they've been given the responsibility to exercise, right? Initiative, decisiveness, whatever other descriptors you want to attach to pastoral leadership there specifically, and a person who maybe they're okay in a position as some kind of pastor that isn't a lead pastor? Is there a non-leading type of pastor? That's one question. Or the flip side of that being, what's the difference between somebody who's maybe not gifted in those leadership things and actually needs to dial it down because maybe they are being aggressively decisive and strong, right? Kind of type A, but to the point of being domineering. Where do you distinguish there? Because I see what you're getting at with the distinction between a chaplain and a leader, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody that might not have the initiative, the directness, the forthrightness, and we would identify a lot of that, at least in our sphere, with what we think of as leadership. But is there a difference between someone that's exercising those and not exercising those in the pastoral office, since the pastoral office is one that necessarily involves leadership? And there's some people, though, that might be exercising those gifts poorly or might not have them at all. How do you sort through that, if that question even makes sense?
No, actually, I think it's incredibly important and a valuable question to have to evaluate. One, leaders can be every personality. I want to make sure I say that first before I even answer that question. A lot of times people think that people have to be an extrovert to be a leader or anything. I mean, I know of some great leaders who are introverts and they have different strengths and giftings. Let me go back, though, to answer that question to what I said previously about mature leaders invite accountability. Now, you can interpret that in a lot of different ways. When I say mature leaders invite accountability, there's a humility there to say, you know what? I'm going to invite my weaknesses in. I challenge people all the time, know your weaknesses as well as you know your strengths. Not so that you live in defeat, so that you can invite others to join you, because if others aren't joining you, there is no movement. Right? So to me, a mature leader invites that accountability. So what qualifies someone to me is not, man, I'm the greatest type A, and I can do this and this and this, and I'm a great pastor. No, it's someone who says, you know what? I know what my giftings are, and I'm going to invite those other components that are not my strengths in, and I'm going to listen to those voices, and I'm going to let them help shape this. People help support what they help create. And so now all of a sudden you have all these other voices speaking into it. That makes a great leader to me, not somebody who already has all the answers, but somebody who's willing to invite that accountability and recognize, I wish every pastor out there and missionary would just raise their hand and go, I don't have all the answers, but I'm inviting you to help.
Yeah.
Because we're functioning out of pride. That's why we have so much territorialism amongst churches today, right?
Yeah.
Right? That's why I can't share wins with people, because that's prideful. And if I share loss with people and something I'm hurting in, I'm a failure. I mean, that's the reality of where we are. Let's just be honest about it.
Yeah.
A successful leader, that's the thing. I don't think they have to be the greatest person out there in terms of leader. They don't have to name a great leader, John Maxwell, whoever it is that we think is a great leader, and go, man, that's who they have to be. I think God uses all kinds of people, but they do have to show enough humility to invite other people in. That means they have to know their strengths and their weaknesses, and they need to say, I need to go get the weaknesses.
Yeah.
And that's even missionaries. I look at that. That's why I love organizations like ABWE and why we support it so much, because they're going, you know what? They may not say it just like this. Paul Davis, the president, may not say it just like this, but what they are demonstrating is, we know you don't have all the answers and you don't have the bandwidth for everything, so we want to help you. Mm-hmm. That's called the church, by the way. I just happen to think we're not very good at being the church.
Yeah.
Oh, that is true.
Oh, absolutely. That's good. So how would we translate some of this into another culture then? So we recently had a conversation, for instance, with Brooks Buser. He's a friend of ours. He's the president of Radius International. Talked about his time ministering among the Yembe Yembe tribe in Papua New Guinea, and all of the nuances of knowing when it's time to take a young fledgling church plant and hand over leadership of that church to the local believers. And that's not always a simple, straightforward thing. but to apply a Western sort of North American idea, even something like a leadership pipeline, that's a very mechanistic metaphor. That's something that makes sense in our kind of consultant culture. Would that even make sense, right, to some of these local believers? So how would you take some of these concepts and translate them down into the context of the mission field in a less developed context?
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, if I can jump in for a second, Joel. I mean, I'm curious too, because now, just as you kind of laid out where you've been, I mean, you've pastored in the East Coast, and Alex and I have lived in Pennsylvania. It's not Connecticut, but it's significantly different than Western Michigan, and it's significantly different than the South, and so especially the Deep South. So I mean, I think you have a little, even though obviously it's all within a North American context, you got a little bit of experience dealing with how different cultures respond to leadership. So I'd love for you to bring in some of your own experiences into that thought process too.
Yeah. And I'll be really vulnerable with you on a couple of these things. I've led in churches. I've helped churches in Georgia, Kentucky, now Michigan, Connecticut. Very, very different, right? But still Western. Mm-hmm. The leadership structure and lessons are still the same no matter what state I've been in. I've learned that as different as they all have the same struggles anyway. Like, truly. I mean, only had about 2% of people who went to a church actively where I lived outside of New York, a little less than that. And here it's closer to about 28 to 30% that go actively. So that's very different, right? But they still have similar struggles. And part of the struggle is just getting people to wake up, the leaders to wake up. I mean, that's one big issue. I also helped lead a nonprofit, though, in Uganda. And it was actually the second largest, and we had to help close it in Uganda, ministering to over 2,000 students, kids with schools, 5 different schools, chicken houses, baby houses, doctor clinics, everything, right? So I speak with a little bit of experience, but it's still very limited. So I want to make sure that that's heard in terms of international. I'm going over in a couple of weeks to the Philippines, and with some partnerships of about 10 churches we have in a seminary over there. And what I've learned even in those conversations is we don't want to give them a Western structure to follow. A Western culture actually can slow a movement, especially for those who are not within a Western culture. Because they're so confused and perplexed by it. They're like, God's already doing all this stuff. And if we're not careful, we're the brake on a movement of God. But at least we did it our way, right? And then the other piece that comes into play is we did learn and discover we need to take those 5 to 7 primary expectations, biblical expectations we have for a ministry and for a missionary, and make sure that those are being held to. And that's what we felt in a ministry that we had in Africa. We had concerns about some stuff with finances and other things, and yet we didn't hold people's feet to the fire on things that we knew were non-negotiable. And so we had a major mistake on that. We've learned from it. We've grown from, we've got to move on, and we're going to keep trying to invest in the kingdom. But I would say if every organization can say, what are those 5 to 7 things that are the non-negotiables, even though you may get there differently than what we would do in the West. Now that does get to methodology. We have the same, I hear it all the time. People are like, oh, we pretty much have the same theology. We just have a different methodology. In time, your methodology will determine your theology. It may take 20 years, but in time, your methodology does impact your theology.
Yeah, and vice versa. Yeah.
Yeah, it's both. We only talk about, theology is good. We're good on that. We're just doing it totally different. Be careful about that, though. We do need to weigh that.
Maybe say your methodology reveals your real theology, rather than just the theology you learned in seminary. How it comes out is what you really believe. Yeah.
Your theology comes at your fingertips all the time.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to quote you guys both.
That's good. I don't think that's original, though. But then what would you say to the pastor who's trying his best to encourage, send, equip, hold the rope for missionaries, realizing we've got some missionaries, though, that might have kind of that lowercase a apostolic, kind of Pauline calling where they're blazing new territory. People are following them. They're really exercising influence. But then I think for a lot of people, and the majority of missionaries that are sent from the West, the leadership gifts might not be there as much. At least that it might be much more of a Timothy type versus a Paul type, somebody who's much more come into an existing team, an existing context as a support, as an encourager, even as a chaplain of sorts. You used that term from the beginning of the episode. We'll bring that in. So what would you say to someone that's involved in sending a lot of individuals with that kind of a makeup? Because I don't think we're saying that that's bad, that they don't have that kind of a makeup on the mission field, but we need all of those elements there together.
I would go back to a little bit of what we said before. One, the relationship. What kind of relationship does the pastor, because if I heard you correctly, you're asking for the local pastor of a church and that relationship that they have with missionaries, what does that really need to look like? I think they have to evaluate what type of relationship they have. We just learned that I had been here for a few years and I still didn't know any of our missionaries. I was like, this is messed up. To me, they're an extension of our church.
Right.
So we have a different policy here. Yeah. And they were just getting a check every quarter, or, every organization is different, but they're just getting a check and we were sending out good money, but it's like, wait a second here. So I said, if we're not going to be in a relationship, we're not going to do it. And the way we do, everybody can do that relationship uniquely. A small church may do it very, very different than we do it, but we do that, as I said before, by having small groups adopt them. If I can have 2 or 3 of our small groups adopt each of our missionaries and be in relationship with them, and we then start defining what that looks like. Hey, it's a 30-minute Zoom call once a month, right? And we also are staggered on how we support them financially, right? But then we actually get to share in needs. So through that relationship, what we have learned is we start learning from each other. So I think if a church only thinks that they have something to offer the missionary and they don't think the missionary has something to offer them, it's already a bad relationship. All right. We can learn from each other and we can grow from each other and how they're trying to do things. Because like it or not, that mission field is coming to us. We used to only go to it. Well, now that mission field is coming to us. We need to learn from each other. Otherwise, it's a one-sided relationship and nobody likes those. So evaluate the relationship and how you're going to do it. All right. How frequent, how often, and then what are you learning from each other is a really important piece.
That's good. Well, if people want to get in contact with you, find out more about Be the Church, even just, connect on some of these leadership resources, how can they do that?
They can go to bethechurch.org. That's one of the things they can do, just bethechurch.org. That's all we're trying to do is just be the church, right? And of course, chapelpoint.org, chapel-point with an E on the end of it. They can go to our website and they can see all the different staff and reach out to people there. And we'd love to help them. The thing we do, I will say this for missionaries, is if you're a missionary here and we're stepping in this pretty heavy, is you automatically can see my staff as your staff. So now they have communications people, right? They have a communications team around them, and they have people who are pushing in discipleship, and they have counselors, and they have all these different components. And I know we're in a larger ministry, but we're saying, hey, my staff is your staff, go. And my staff knows that when they get that phone call, that's no different than me calling.
Yeah.
And I think that keeps us open-handed. And it gives us a posture of that humility that we need to go, this is about the kingdom. We're very small pieces. We're so small in this. So.
Wow, that bears repeating. Yeah, if your missionaries don't feel like the church staff exists to support them as much as it exists to support the pastor, why not? That's a great question. That's a great insight worth ending on. And Joel Wayne, we thank you for joining us here today, and we thank you today for watching or listening to the Missions Podcast, which is a ministry of ABWE. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com, and to support the show, which we would highly value, you can go to missionspodcast.com/support. You can learn more about ABWE at abwe.org. And of course, when you're subscribing to the podcast feed, we encourage you to leave a positive review and rating. That will help favor us in the algorithm rankings and get this content in front of more people who can discover it, be blessed by it, and share it with others, and to spread the good news. And of course, as always, we owe you our deepest gratitude for being a part of the show, a part of the family that listens and supports this content. So thanks for watching and listening.